Welcome to the Life Safety Podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
No problem. I know we were supposed to meet. We had a meeting set up, and then the pandemic hit, right?
Yeah.
And it's put a pause on the whole world, and here we are trying to adjust and adapt.
That's right.
So first off, let's go ahead and get you introduced. Tell us who you are, what you do, and how long you've been in the business.
Okay, well, the short version is that I'm someone who's grown up in the swinging door industry. I just turned 58 just a couple of weeks ago.
Congratulations. Happy birthday.
I've been in the industry since 1985, so 35 years I've been in the industry. And I started out working for small distributors of doors, frames, and hardware, selling them to contractors. And through that process, I was introduced to the Door and Hardware Institute. I became an apprentice, and then I became an architectural hardware consultant, and later a certified door consultant. And in '96, I ended up going to work for DHI, where I was the director of education and certification for most of my almost 19 years at DHI. I retired from DHI in the summer of 2014. So it's been a little over 6 years.
Oh, wow.
And I had no intention about doing what I'm doing now. I had other plans. But after I had retired, I was contacted by people that I know from other industries asking me, well, what would it take for our people to be able to do their own inspections, and how do we do this, and what kind of training would be involved, and how do we go forward with this? Because as you know, somewhere around 2015, we started hearing that the healthcare industry was going to start, they were moving to the 2012 edition of the Life Safety Code, and that was going to bring into play the inspections. So these individuals were from the healthcare industry. So I teasingly said, well, okay, I built one certification program, I can build another. And about 6 months later, they came back and said, oh, really? Were you serious? And I said, well, no, but okay. And that led to some work I've been doing with ASHE, the American Society for Healthcare Engineering. And that's been a really good transition from my old life, which was really focused on teaching people in the door and hardware industry about the products that they sell or manufacture. And now I'm really focused on the end users, the people that live with this stuff every day, and they have to maintain it, and making sure they know at least enough about these systems that they can do a decent job maintaining them and keeping them in working conditions. So that's kind of the short version of how I've gotten to where I am now.
Nice. Yeah, I actually was fortunate enough to, you were one of my instructors when I took the formal DHI FDAI credential back in 2017.
Wow.
And yeah, and so it was in Virginia, I think, where the class was held.
So you're saying it's my fault?
Basically, yes. You opened up the can of worms.
Well,
no, it's been great. And that was actually going to lead into one of my other questions is, you kind of alluded to it. Obviously, there's been a bigger boom in the fire door inspection market, to your point, from when 2016, the 2012 adoption of the Life Safety Code.
Right.
So that obviously, there's been a lot of misnomers, a lot of miseducation. There's pretty much all kinds of interpretations on when the inspection takes place, which we know it's annual, and how to do the inspection. So briefly, just real quick, when did the advent of the annual fire door inspection come into play? What NFPA 80 standard, had it listed, or and then when did it actually get enforced?
Okay, well, that's a really good question. And what most people aren't aware of is in NFPA 80 and prior to the 2007 edition of NFPA 80 specifically, there was a big transition, transformation, I should say, in NFPA 80 between the 1999 edition and the 2007 edition. There were lots of things. There was that gap, that 8-year gap in the publishing of the standard. And there were several iterations of the standard that never were published because these changes were so far-ranging. We added new chapters. The document got changed to fire doors and other opening protectives.
Keith, so let me ask you. So what you're saying is, from 1999 up until 2007, there wasn't no official cycle revision of the NFPA 80.
Right. There's a gap. If you look at it, there's a gap. But in the 1999 and earlier editions of NFPA 80, we had a care and maintenance chapter. And in that care and maintenance chapter, there was one sentence, one provision that required fire doors, all types of fire doors covered in NFPA 80, to be inspected frequently, and broken or malfunctioning hardware was to be replaced immediately.
So that frequently was subjective to interpretation.
It was so vague, it was really rendered unenforceable because we each have our different ideas of what frequent is. Is it weekly, monthly, daily, yearly? What is it? And then it also didn't say exactly what was to be inspected. So one of the big changes between 99 and 2007 was that we came out with, for a couple of the door types, a list of inspection points. And the first edition, or the 2007 edition, had 11 inspection points. And that's where some people also kind of short circuit. They look at those 11 points and they think that's all that you need to inspect. And that's not what NFPA 80 says. There's a statement at the very beginning of that list that says, as a minimum, the following shall be inspected and tested. But as you become more familiar with swinging doors, you learn that there are lots of, even though they're all swinging doors, for instance, some doors are very simple. They have 3 hinges, a latch, and a door closer. Right. Others are much more complex with all the electrified hardware. So the more stuff on a door, the more things need to be inspected. Makes sense. Yet some people would, well, that's not listed in those 11 points. I don't need to inspect it. So there's been some education there trying to teach people, here's what we are inspecting. And then from 2007 to the 2019 edition of NFPA 80, we've had a new edition every 3 years. And each year something is getting adjusted, improved in these inspection requirements. And they're becoming more and more fine-tuned. But the one missing item from from 2007 to 2019, the biggest missing item is that 80 does not address older existing doors. And that's where people try, they take today's requirements and they try to fit them to yesterday's products, and they don't fit. So you come up with all of these other lists of deficiencies that under today, if this was a new door, yes, they're deficiencies. But on the older doors, they're not deficiencies, because we have to, one of the first principles of these inspections is that you have to inspect the doors with the original code and standard requirements that were in effect at the time that door was installed.
Gotcha.
And a really good example of that would be a wire glass. Older wire glass wasn't required to be marked.
Yeah,
today, wire glass is required to be marked.
Right. No,
so there are a lot of wrinkles in all that that are slowly being worked out in NFPA 80.
So just to reiterate for the audience, so wired glass for existing applications, depending on when that building was built, is acceptable.
Oh, it's absolutely, yeah, it's absolutely acceptable. And the other wrinkle in all of this is even though NFPA 80 today, you won't find in the body of the standard any direct reference to wire glass. It just talks about fire protection rated glazing, glass and glazing, and fire resistance rated glass and glazing. But outside of that, and again, it all goes back to the authority having jurisdiction.
Right.
Some today, authorities having jurisdiction still accept wire glass, and not just little 10 by 10 pieces of wire glass, they accept larger wire glass. And the AHJs in some cases, don't require wire glass to be marked, even though NFPA 80 and NFPA 101 and even the International Building Code requires all new glass to be marked.
Right.
So there's all these little wrinkles that you have to kind of balance. So the people who are out here doing inspections, they really need to find out in a particular area what's being enforced.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, when these inspections take place, the facility manager or the building owner, they're paying for whether it's replacing the glass. Now there are companies that will come in and for a fee, they'll put an etching on the glass to say that it's fire rated. They don't change the glass, right? They're kind of like adding a label to it saying it's fire rated. So is it necessary? Is even that level of work necessary?
All right, let me get right into clearances, because in my opinion, excessive clearances between the door and the frame are probably the #1 deficiency when it comes to fire door assembly inspections. And there's a lot of misnomers out there where folks think that, you know, installing vertical astragals or door sweeps, you know, compensates for those gaps, but really they're just covering the gaps, masking the issue. Can you just touch base a little bit on that? And some of the logic that folks have, and I somewhat agree with, is that you have the stop. And so the stop, in a way, does constitute, well, it's a stop, so it's a barrier. But nonetheless, you still have that gap that exists between the edge of the frame and the edge face of the door. Can you kind of just go over clearances and what NFPA 80 is trying to spell out there, and whether the stop of the door is actually, of the frame rather, constitutes not having a gap?
Absolutely, and you're right on all counts, because there's a lot of confusion out here about how important the gaps are. The first thing you need to two things about the clearance, the operating clearance gaps around the swinging door. First is latch bolt engagement. So the more distance we have from the vertical edge of the door to the face of the strike plate, the less engagement we have of the latch bolt into their strikes. Now, it really depends on which type of latching hardware device that we're inspecting on a door. For instance,
Keith, real quick, just because you said that, you made me think of something. When you said the latch throw, that's how much the latch has to protrude into the strike, correct?
Correct. Okay. And I'm going
to. What I wanted to ask, I'm sorry, I know we're trying. Is that's an example of one of those requirements that's not on the checklist of the inspection criteria, but falls within NFPA 80. So that would be a perfect example where you still need to check it on the inspection portion, but someone might say, well, that's not part of the 11 point or the 13 point or the 14 point, depending on which version they're following of NFPA 80.
That's exactly right. And it's one of these elements that you have to, as an inspector of these doors, you have to understand. We are required to check the gaps. The reason we check the gaps has to do with latch bolt engagement. And you're right, nowhere in NFPA 80 or any other code does it say what that dimension is supposed to be. But in the listing of the latching hardware devices, because everything, when you read NFPA 80, you'll see many times, especially in Chapter 6 for the swinging doors that we're talking about today, you'll see where it defers to as tested by the manufacturer, as tested and as listed, words to that effect. And what that means is if we have a mortise lock, a grade 1 mortise lock, Builder's Heart BHMA A156.13 grade 1 mortise lock, every one of them have a 3/4 inch latch bolt. That's the projection from the face of the lock to the tip of the latch bolt when it's fully extended. When the door is closed, and let's go with wood doors, it's an easier example. We're allowed to have 1/8 of an inch maximum gap, right?
Right.
So if we have a 3/4 inch latch bolt throw, we have 5/8 inch engagement. Stick with me, it gets a little bit, that's a lot of engagement. So Same door, but now we use a board lock, a grade 1 board lock. And right out of the box, they come with a 1/2 inch latch throw.
Okay.
So now we have, with that same 1/8 inch gap between the vertical edge of the door and the strike plate, we have 3/8 of an inch engagement. And now if that gap becomes 1/4 of an inch or something greater than 1/8 of an inch, we start to reduce the latch bolt engagement of that device pretty significantly. Even
Right.
a 1/16 of an inch is 25%. Well, 20%. Anyway, but when you check the listing of those board locks, they require a 1/2 inch, a minimum of a 1/2 inch latch bolt throw, which now is when we have to do the math. 1/8 inch gap means we have to have a 3/8 inch, we have to maintain a 3/8 inch latch bolt engagement on that device. So mortise locks, it's less of a problem. So for a single door, if you go into the fire door test, the fire door test require 1/2 inch latch bolt projection. So a mortise lock always, on a single door, a mortise lock always exceeds that requirement.
Gotcha.
Board locks, depending on the clearance, now we've got a little bit of an issue. Same thing when we have pairs of doors. The fire door test and NFPA 80 requires, well, it's the minimum latch throw as per the listing of the device. So in most cases for pairs of doors, we're looking at a minimum of 3/4 of an inch latch bolt throw. That's all points of latching. So it's the active door latching into the vertical side of the inactive door and the top and bottom flush bolts. And nobody checks the bottom flush bolt.
Right.
And it's not just the throw that we have, because most doors have a 3/4 inch clearance under the door. So if we have a flush bolt when it's fully retracted, that is flush with the bottom of the door, and we extend it, that travel is only 3/4 of an inch. It won't engage in the strike.
Makes sense.
So it just has to be adjusted so that in the retracted position, it's about 1/4 of an inch, give or take, above the strike, so that when it's extended, it has the proper latch bolt engagement. But these are some of the subtleties that no one else is going to think about.
Right.
We're experts. We have to be aware of these. The building management people, the people who install them even, they don't know a lot of these little details, and it's on us to make sure these devices are properly installed. But the other problem that we have with excessive gaps is when we decide that we're going to use gasketing, the larger the gap, the more difficult it is to gasket that door properly.
Right.
So you have to really maintain the operating clearances as tight as possible. Very quickly, just as an aside to what we just talked about with clearances, the Fire Protection Research Foundation, part of NFPA, is in phase 2 of a study for the effect that excessive clearances have on swinging fire doors and fire development.
Oh, wow.
And in fact, they are just next week at QAI Laboratories, they're going to start burning, conducting some full-scale fire door tests on door assemblies, first off, that have exactly the clearances as specified in NFPA 80. These are completely generic door assemblies. We're just doing it as an experiment to see how NFPA 80's gaps perform.
Okay.
Which are different, by the way, than the fire door test without any justification. NFPA 252, UL 10B, UL 10C. NFPA 80 is not in sync with the fire door test standards.
Oh, wow.
So we're going to start out with NFPA 80's baseline, and then subsequent, we have 16 rounds of testing, 16 different door units that we're going to test. We're going to increase the gaps. We're burning hollow metal doors and frames and fire-rated wood doors with metal frames. But we're slowly going to increase the gaps to 1/4 inch at the vertical and top edges, and the meeting styles of pairs of doors to an inch at the bottom of the door to see what that does. And all that's really going to tell us at this point is how those larger gaps might affect a swinging door fire assembly in regards to it being able to remain closed and forming a barrier to contain fire.
Okay.
What the testing can't tell us, what this round of testing can't tell us, is when the gaps are so large that the door assembly might survive the fire test, but because the gaps are so large, that the door assembly might lose containment.
Right.
And that fire could spread beyond. And that would be as bad as the door failing.
Right.
So there is a point that the gaps are going to be too large. And that's probably going to be a third phase of this project. So we're probably a couple years away from having any really good answers to this issue. But clearances have been, in the history of NFPA 80, and I've studied it all the way back to the 1941 edition, clearances have been probably the number one headache for all the technical committees. So this is nothing new. It's more prevalent today because we're doing these inspections, and then we're doing these adjustments, and there are products now that mitigate the larger clearances, and they seem to do a good job. You mentioned that people might use a door sweep or an astragal or something else on the edges of the doors to mitigate these clearances. And as you said, they cover the clearances. They don't correct the clearances. And if it's not specifically tested for that application, we don't know how it's going to perform. Interestingly, I was involved with some fire door testing from a hardware manufacturer whose partial solution was to add more intumescent to a category A type door. So the category A type door already has intumescent material built into the vertical edges.
Okay.
So on pairs of doors, they put a metal edge. Think of it as a door guard, the full height of the door, edge guard, the full height of the door, and they put another strip of intumescent material on it.
But this is internal to the door.
Well, no. Actually, no. They had a C-shaped or U-shaped channel that ran the vertical height of the door.
Okay.
And between the two doors, they put a piece of exposed. They put a piece of intumescent material.
Oh, okay.
And what happened as the test progressed, the intumescent exerted so much force against the opposing door that it actually caused the wood doors to bow almost the full 1 3/4 inches. So these doors were.
This kind of reminds me of the issue of putting intumescent fire stop around a damper, which could have the same effects where it could buckle the damper when it expands.
That's exactly right. And the result was that the doors, before it was a 90-minute test, somewhere around 50 minutes, they had to call the test because the doors had bowed to the point where the latch was about to let loose. When they took them to the hose stream test, the doors blew apart.
Wow.
They just disintegrated. So too much intumescent is a bad thing. As you just said, it'll crush a damper, it'll crush ductwork, it will cause doors to break. So it's not as simple as, well, we'll just put more gasketing on it, we'll just put more intumescent on it. It has to be the right type, and it has to be the right amount. So it's not an easy answer. It's not as easy as people think it might be.
Right. Is it safe to say, potentially, with some of this research you mentioned just briefly earlier, that those gaps, those clearances based off of that, maybe later editions of NFPA 80 could make those clearances slightly more?
Well, it could lead to that. In fact, the primary sponsor for this phase 2 testing is ASHE,
okay,
American Society for Healthcare Engineering, because it's going to possibly work in the favor of their members. But all the testing that we're doing is just experimental. and no significant changes can come out of it, only because we can't test every type of door.
Right.
We can't test, and we can't test yesterday's doors, which are the greater majority of doors that are out there are older existing doors. And when I say older existing doors, 20 years and older.
Right.
And so we can't test every combination of door frame and hardware construction that's out there. So all we can kind of do is get a little bit of an idea of where it might be going. My guess is, and this is purely my guess, is that this information might lead to changes in the fire door test standards themselves first. And then it would be up to the individual door and frame manufacturers to decide if and when or how they want to start testing their products to whatever the new standard might be. It's very likely that we'd draw a line in the sand and saying doors installed before 2030 have to have today's clearances, and doors that are new after that date might be able to have, because those would be the doors that are tested with those larger clearances.
Right. No,
but right now it's anybody's guess what we're going to find. It's just as likely that we could find, for instance, the biggest difference between NFPA 80 and any other fire door test is that the clearance under the doors for a single door, they're tested with 3/8 of an inch. That's how they're tested. For pairs of doors, it's 1/4 of an inch.
Oh, wow.
80 allows 3/4 of an inch, and there's never been any technical justification documented as to why there's a discrepancy between the fire door test and what 80 allows. I can tell you why it's probably like that.
Right.
There's no technical justification for it.
And talking about these clearances, they're measured from the pool side, but what about the undercut? I noticed the undercut does not specify for the undercut clearance to be checked from the pool side. Is that fair game from either side?
It usually is, because the thing that you have to bear in mind with swinging doors, many of them have that beveled latch style to the door. So we measured on the long side of the door, the pool side of the door. And because they're beveled, we're allowed to have, the gap between pairs of doors with beveled edges is going to be twice as large, at least, on the inside, on the push side of the doors. But at the bottom of the doors, we have should have a 90-degree edge. So whether we measure it on the inside or outside, it should be relatively the same, depending, if there's maybe a little slope in the floor.
And just to kind of reiterate back to clearances, if we got a 7-foot door and we're measuring the clearance, and it's great, for 90% of that 7 feet linear footage, those 2 inches where it's off, it makes it non-compliant. Is that correct? Because I know there's some interpretation. Well, it's only a little wiggle room here on the very top, but the majority of it's intact or within the tolerances.
Yeah. The way 80's clearances should be checked is it's the full length, full height of the vertical edge, full width of the horizontal edge at the top of the door or at the bottom of the door. It's that whole gap consistently. And that does get a little bit tricky sometimes, because if the frames aren't installed just not perfectly, but reasonably plumb, then we're going to have, if they're spread apart at the bottom, we have wider gaps at the bottom. Usually the top of the door is not so much the problem. Usually it's the latch edge or the top edge of the door, because the frame's a little bit out of square or it's a little bit spread apart. The hinges usually keep the hinge style, they constrain it. They keep it close within spec, usually, unless somebody shims them to take up the larger gap. Okay. Another area that people overthink sometimes is we have today, and we have for many years, had fire-rated continuous hinges that fit between the door rabbet of the frame and the vertical edge of the door. And they can take up 3/8 of an inch. But that's obviously much larger than what 80 allows for the distance between the vertical edge of the door and the stripe. But we're filling it with a fire-rated hinge. So you might have a little bit of a gap at the bottom and a little bit of a wider gap at the very bottom of the door. That's okay. That's how that continuous hinge, that door and frame were tested as an assembly. That's where you have to go back to as tested and as listed. So you can overthink it and say, well, yes, it's too much, but what are you going to do about it?
Right.
And it's even the same with the surface mounted or half surface mounted continuous hinges. There might be a little bit of a gap there, but it's as tested as that hinge was tested.
Makes
So
sense.
we don't have to worry about that.
But I wanted to jump into field labeling. There's been an advent of field labeling as these inspections are being more enforced and folks are being educated. They're finding that the doors or frames or the kick plate doesn't bear a UL10C label or some kind of label. And so you're starting to see a lot of field labeling taking place. What are your thoughts on that? And I'm seeing some newer folks being, I guess, accredited to do these field labeling of the fire door components. Does that have to come from the factory? I know NFPA 80 now has language in there, especially in the newer edition, and it's starting to kind of hone in on that as well. Just what are your general thoughts about field labeling?
Field labeling is a very important topic right now that the NFPA 80 Technical Committee is dealing with, and we're trying to sort it out and get a handle on it. As you mentioned, probably in the last, say, 10 years, there are a number of non-testing lab companies who have gone through an accreditation process of sorts to become field labelers. They'll put their company's label on a door or a frame, or in some cases, some hardware products, and they call it fire rated. Now, there are a couple things that we have to really be aware of. The field label process, putting a field label on an existing door or frame doesn't change anything about the door or frame. We're adding a new sticker to it or a new label to it, but we haven't changed it physically.
Right.
It's not, and it's the other expectation from the end users is if a company puts a label on it and it says that component now is fire rated, they think their opening is now 100% compliant. They've got their new label.
Right.
In a label of any type doesn't mean that the product complies with the codes and standards. All that these labels mean is that the labeled product is identical to the counterparts that successfully tested, passed the fire door testing. So this field labeling process is very, especially from a non-testing lab entity, it's a concern to me. There are some companies out there that are putting labels on stuff that shouldn't be labeled. There was one recently that came to my attention where they were taking panic hardware devices. Panic hardware devices are not permitted to be used on fire rated doors, but panic hardware
that's
devices.
a big one right now. Yeah, panic hardware is a big one.
Right. So panic hardware, they in an inspection, they find that panic hardware was installed on an existing fire door. So this particular company removes the dogging mechanism from the panic hardware devices and puts their company's fire exit hardware label on it, and they think they're done.
Wow.
Well, that is not the only difference between panic hardware and fire exit hardware. The internal components, sometimes the actual latch case assemblies are physically different. Aesthetically, they look the same, but internally they're different products. So the owners are left with this misconception that their products are now safe, that they are now converted magically into fire exit hardware devices. And a testing lab would never do that. They would never attempt to do that. They would want that device either to be correctly repaired or replaced with a new device. And that's really what needs to be done. You can't convert, you just can't convert these devices. So that's a concern. So we've got that going on. There are There are some field labelers out there, and this gets down to the individuals. Some of them doing the work that will put a label on anything. I was at a seminar for a inspection company just about a year ago, and they were in the middle of their presentation, and they were talking about construction labeled doors, that they had found some construction labeled doors. And without going too far afield, is a construction labeled door is declared on the label to not be fire rated because there's something special about it. There's something out of the ordinary about it.
Okay.
But they're used in place of fire doors because of whatever necessity that the architect had for that space. So we've got a door of fire rated construction that might be too large to be tested, or it might have a special hardware prep, but for whatever reason, it's got a construction label on it.
Okay.
So when they got to this part of the presentation, they said, if you have these in your building, because they were talking to end users, we can put a new label on them.
Wow.
And right up went my hand. I said, no, you can't. You can't put a new label on these things. The manufacturer has declared it to not be a fire rated door. So this other person who happened to be from a field labeling company, a non-testing lab field labeling company, stood up, oh yeah, I do it all the time. I just take the label off. Who's going to know?
Oh, wow.
And I looked at him and I said, wow, you're going to know that you've done it. And now you know you can't do it, but you know, and he and I had a long conversation afterwards, and let's just say I wasn't successful in convincing him of the error of his ways. So I'm sure he's still out there doing it today.
Wow. And just real quick, an example of a construction door, and I think you tried to allude to it. So it would be like if a manufacturer tests his doors that are 3070 only, and for whatever reason, they wanted a door that's 10 foot in length, and they never tested that 10 foot within a testing furnace and under those UL systems. Right. Then that's where they would put an example where they would say, it's built the same way we do the 3070s, but we've never physically tested a 10-foot door. Therefore, we're going to put this construction label.
Right. That's exactly right. And the proper process in the construction, in the construction documentation process of a building like that is that somewhere along the line, someone has to ask for written permission, a variance from the building code to allow these special doors to be installed. So in the history of the building, there's written documentation, should be anyway, that the doors were allowed to be used in place of a completely labeled fire door assembly.
So if you didn't have that, it's safe to say if you're doing a general NFPA 80 inspection on that door, without that documentation or evidence of documentation, you would probably cite it for not being a labeled fire door.
Well, that's a really good point, Ruben. And this is what I tell people to do. When they find a construction labeled door, first thing you have to do is flag it, put a comment on it, construction labeled door, and maybe a comment like research the history of the door. Why is this? Verify why this is a construction label. Okay. I wouldn't call it deficiency. I would just call it out that it's something that we need to, because sometimes after the inspections, we've got to do this research to verify what it is we've seen. Then you treat it exactly like you do any other fire door. Does it latch? Does it close? Does it have, you know, whatever it needs to have? And in that process, maybe you'll find that it's got a larger section of glass in it than is traditionally allowed, or it's got a special cutout. For wood doors, there was a time with a concealed overhead stop, wood doors, the wood fire rated doors, the maximum rating was 20 minutes with that big mortise in the top of the door. Today, there are certain constructions that we can have up to 45 minutes with that concealed overhead stop. But yesterday's doors, again, these older existing doors, they weren't tested that way. And that prep alone might be the reason why you have a construction label on that door. So you have to do the research.
Got it. And then ultimately, who's qualified? I know, we get that question a lot. Who's qualified to inspect a fire door? Many other life safety features, like for example, fire alarm, there's a certification, there's local state licensing or local, jurisdiction licensing that you have to undergo. But what about fire doors?
That's another good question. When you read NFPA 80, it talks about the qualified person standard. And when you read the definition, it's very broad. It doesn't require any particular level of certification. It requires basically that the persons performing this work be knowledgeable about the types of doors and their operating components that they're inspecting. And that could be, hey, I took a class. Here's my certificate. I'm a certified fire door inspector. I've got my certificate from DHI. I've been doing this for 1,000 years. I just know it.
Right.
I've run into people. I'm a former AHJ, as though that invokes some all-knowing, all levels of knowledge.
Right.
That they know everything, because, and there are some very knowledgeable AHJs out there, but we all have our areas of expertise. I know swinging doors probably better than anybody on the planet. I would be the wrong guy to inspect an overhead rolling door. I know enough to be dangerous with them. And that brings up another point. Some of these other types of doors in NFPA 80, when you get into the sliding doors, the overhead doors, these larger door assemblies, they can be very dangerous if they're not reset properly, if they're not maintained properly and tested properly. So it really requires people with the correct knowledge. And my personal belief is that they should be factory authorized persons doing that work, not necessarily factory employees,
right?
But they should be, normally these are products that are installed by factory trained installers. Those are probably the best people to do the work. When you get into Chapter 6 type doors, there's no requirement for training for the installers, and very ambiguous qualifications for the persons performing the inspections right now. And they become very, very complicated. The more stuff we put on the door, the more complicated now we have to coordinate all and research all of the different components that are on these doors.
That makes sense. Now I want to talk about smoke doors. I call it the forgotten door, because there's all this criteria for NFPA 80. There's the 14 or whatever your checklist is for your fire doors. But then when it comes to smoke doors, and specifically I'm talking about the 2010 edition of NFPA 105, because I've looked at the 2019 version, and it pretty much mirrors NFPA 80, and it actually seems like there's more criteria for the inspection portion, which I was very surprised by. But because 2010 is the enforceable edition, and for healthcare specifically, for folks with CMS accreditation, how do you approach a smoke door inspection in today's enforced standards?
Okay,
that's 2010 edition.
That is another important subject that we need to spend more time on. In fact, there's a misconception about what is a smoke door first.
Right.
So when we think about, and we'll use healthcare facilities, healthcare occupancies as an example. Inside the healthcare occupancies, we have doors and smoke barriers, and we have doors and smoke partitions.
Right.
Those are not smoke doors. You have to pay attention to how they're phrased. Doors and smoke barriers, doors and smoke partitions. Human nature, we kind of, we truncate, we abbreviate, that's a smoke door. Well, no, not in the context of the codes. In the context of the International Building Code of NFPA 101, a smoke door assembly, an S-labeled door assembly, is a door that is first required to be tested under UL 1784, and it needs to comply with NFPA 105. And you're absolutely right in that the 2010 and even the 2013 edition of NFPA 105 were incomplete, to be kind, about what smoke door assemblies, what swinging smoke door assemblies are. But what is in those standards is it requires those doors to comply with UL 1784, just like the building code. So you can go to chapter, I think it's I'm going to say chapter 4, where it talks about that the doors have to comply with UL 1784. Now, just like we have a fire door test, you have to study UL 1784 to see what those criteria are. First thing that it requires is that the test unit is fully operable when it's mounted to the test chamber. So the test door has to be fully operable. And UL 1784 explicitly requires positive latching hardware on swinging doors.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, see, and that's an important point to remember, because when we get into doors and smoke barriers in healthcare facilities, we don't necessarily require positive latching hardware.
Right. It gets interesting because of the cross corridor allows you to negate the latching, but conversely, if that smoke door, I'm calling them smoke doors now, but if that opening protective on a smoke barrier lands on a corridor, not a cross corridor, then it has to latch because of the corridor requirements, not necessarily from the 105. So it gets real tricky when you're looking at these doors.
Right. So what you have to know then is where in the code, and specifically, we'll go back to healthcare occupancies, where are those doors that are required to comply with UL 1784 and NFPA 105? Where are those doors located? And there are only a few. So under the 2012 edition of the Life Safety Code, new swinging doors serving as a horizontal exit. Those doors are going to be cross corridor. You might be, most times they're double egress. So not only is it going to require positive latching, most times they're going to be fire rated, but because of some design considerations, we may have a non-fire rated S-labeled smoke door assembly.
Wow.
So it gets a little bit, because we're all conditioned, if it's a fire door, it's a smoke door. Well, that's not necessarily true. Then we get into staying in healthcare occupancies, a door serving a area of refuge. So that would be, like, for lack of a better term, I'll call it a vestibule that's in front of a stair tower door on a floor. So the door from the corridor into the vestibule might be a 20-minute rated S-labeled door, smoke door assembly, that requires gasketing. The door from the area of refuge into the stair tower is not an S-labeled door. It's a regular fire-rated door. And that's going to be probably a 90-minute door in today's construction. And then the other one is when we get into what's called the occupant evacuation elevator shaft system doors. And you have to, that's a mouthful, but you have to study where that is. But certain doors serving that, like the elevator lobby door, if we have an elevator lobby, that pair of doors is going to be an S-labeled pair of doors. It's probably going to be fire rated. Probably going to be like a 90-minute rated door. So we've got different, those are the only 3 times in a healthcare occupancy where 101 requires doors to be smoke doors. And you have to, it sometimes helps to keep this in mind. The title of NFPA 105 is Smoke Door Assemblies and Other Opening Protectives. So when the codes say, when they invoke NFPA 105, they're saying this is a smoke door. When we look at the doors and smoke barriers and smoke partitions, they do not require compliance with NFPA 105. They're not fire rated in most cases, and they don't require compliance with NFPA 105. So we have an education need out there to get people to use the right terminology about which doors are which. The other problem that we have, going back to the inspections and tying it back into the smoke doors, is that when we look at the labels on the modern fire doors, we see that capital letter S, right? And it's in a box with it, or it's got a highlighted background on it. And then we usually have some little verbiage there that says category, or it says gasketing required, see installation instructions, or some vagary statement to that effect. What that means is, the first thing you have to, as an inspector, the first thing we have to understand is that S on that label does not require that fire door to be gasketed unless the location of the door itself is in the building where that particular door is also required to comply with NFPA 105 or UL 1784. Then that S becomes valid, but only when we add gasketing.
Okay, because I think what I'm seeing out in the field is when some of these inspectors see that S label, they automatically assume that gasket's required, and they'll cite it for the lack of having a smoke gasket around the perimeter.
They do. Now, again, my professional opinion, I've never understood why we don't do it. In fact, when I teach DHI classes about scheduling, designing door openings and putting hardware on it, I recommend always putting gasketing on a fire door. Why not? It's cheap insurance, but that's not what the codes require. So it's professional opinion versus what the codes require. But the other factor that we have to keep in mind is that today, almost all of the buildings are being constructed in compliance with one version or another of the International Building Code.
I know where you're getting to.
And when you go into the building code, it has more applications for doors to be smoke and draft control doors. And that's a very specific phrase in the International Building Code that invokes compliance with UL 1784 and NFPA 105. So under the International Building Code, I'm probably going to oversimplify it, but basically the doors along a corridor are going to be fire rated and they're going to be S labeled doors. 101 doesn't have that general requirement for the fire rated doors. So if you are, and the way I try to tell people to administer this is if you are performing these inspections in accordance with 101 and the gasketing, you're in a corridor, you have a fire rated door and no gasketing, it's not an issue because 101 doesn't require it. But if, on the other hand, you were inspecting that same door in compliance with the state building code or local building code, which is going to be IBC based, now you need to comply with the IBC requirements, and now that gasketing might be, the missing gasketing would be a deficiency. So when you're doing this, there's a certain logic to it to put gasketing on those doors, even though it's not necessarily a deficiency. But that's the kind of stuff that as inspectors, we need to call out.
Right.
And say, okay, if you put gasketing on this door, you will comply with IBC and you will exceed 101's requirements.
Right.
Now,
another big factor when you mention IBC is that in most modern designs for healthcare occupancies, going back to that, on those open and protected for smoke barriers, they're specifying 20-minute fire rated labeled doors. So then on these smoke barriers, you got these 20-minute labeled doors. Now NFPA 80 takes precedence and you have to follow it as a fire door assembly. Is that correct?
Well, yes. And well, I'm going to say yes, but, and I'm going to qualify it this way. When you read it, that particular door that you're talking about, it's a 20-minute fire door construction. And there's a subtlety here because you go to some of the wood door manufacturers and even the hollow metal door manufacturers, but specifically wood doors, they have a new label that they're putting on non-fire rated doors. And when you read it, it says 20-minute fire door construction.
Ah, okay.
And it will say positive latching hardware not required. If we take that 20-minute door, the traditional, the real 20-minute fire rated door, every one of those labels requires positive latching hardware.
Right.
Which is what NFPA 80 requires. So there we have this subtlety. So into kind of tying this all together with the smoke doors and this 20-minute fire rated construction door and the fire door, now we have three different types of labels that are attached to the doors, that two of which are not fire door labels. Some of the wood door manufacturers now have a S label smoke door assembly label for non-fire rated doors. It looks, from a distance, it looks like a label. It even has, typically most of the wood doors have a Warnock Kersey or Intertech marking on them these days. So you'll see the Intertech mark on the label, it looks like a fire door label until you read it.
Ah,
When you have that 20-minute fire door construction label, it looks like a label until you read it. And then
all
we've got
right.
the real labels.
Okay,
We got
interesting.
different things to look for.
Okay, well, great. Last topic I want to touch on, and I know here we're running out of time. I'm not sure if you got a little bit more time, but obviously we're in a pandemic still. What are your thoughts on inspecting doors during the pandemic? And what about, have you thought about remote inspections, virtual inspections for fire doors?
Well, yeah, the pandemic has made things very difficult. It's already difficult enough. For anyone who's been in a hospital building and conducting fire door assemblies, you're moving from one part of the building and you're just moving throughout the entire building.
Right.
Quick story, my first hospital that I inspected, I was shocked about how filthy certain parts of a hospital really are because of the air handling and the positive pressure and the negative pressure air spaces. The dust collects around the door assemblies. You've got to wipe them down. You got to, to see everything. And, you come out just filthy from being in these places. And I remember being in one area of the building and literally throughout the day, just moving from a dirty area into a clean area, back to a dirty area and going through like a little tornado going through the hospital,
Right.
completely unaware that I was probably contaminating the clean spaces. Later, as I became more involved with ASHE actually has a healthcare worker certification that people can take online that just makes you aware of moving about a healthcare facility. And some facilities now require anybody who's going to be in the building space to go through that program and have that certification, in addition to what other qualifications they may have, that they also have this, because it has to do with infectious control.
Right.
And just all those different protocols. And there are times, for instance, if you want to go into a post-op or pre-op area or the sterile processing areas, you've got to put protective clothing on. Maybe you have to protect your cart. You may have to wear a hairnet, beard net, whatever the case may be,
Right.
to get into those spaces. Wash in, wash out, scrub in, scrub out, that type of thing. So there are a lot of considerations. So with the advent of now COVID, it's pretty well brought the inspection process to a halt. In fact, CMS and I think it was the Joint Commission, CMS I think is the primary source, they put out a statement earlier this year allowing facilities to apply, it was either a 60-day or a 90-day extension. I'd have to look it up.
Yeah, it was categorical waivers. Basically, it was a waiver that they were allowing to negate or postpone your testing.
Right, and they can do that multiple times. And as it's turning out, the way this pandemic is unfolding, the immediate emergency in like New York City is less now than it was, but in Texas, and in Florida, it's starting to become more of an emergency.
Yeah,
so
I'm here in Houston, and it's getting pretty bad.
Oh yeah, so it's just moving around the country, and so it's going to be market driven. But aside from doing the inspections, then becomes how do you do the repairs? Because now somebody's got to get in there with tools and equipment and move about and do that work. So it's brought everything kind of to a somewhat of a screeching halt, like just about everything else has.
Right.
But it's a different world, and it'll come back around. But I think part of that CMS statement was that they expected the doors to be properly maintained, even though they weren't being inspected. The expectation was that the doors were being properly maintained.
Right, definitely. All right, I did have two little small subjects I wanted to touch that I just remembered, and we could just briefly discuss on it. I want to talk about, I'll tell you which two, delamination on wood doors when the laminate comes defaced,
Mm-hmm.
how much of that is allowed within NFPA 80, and then at what point, what's the threshold for, all right, this is a deficiency that falls under no open holes or breaks on the door? That's one. And then the second thing I just briefly wanted to talk about too is integrated testing as it pertains to automated fire doors that have, panic hardware or fire exit hardware that's, recessed in or retracted. What I'm seeing out there when it comes to that is that the fire alarm folks may test it, but not ensure that it latches or ensure that the exit hardware is projecting, panic hardware in this context. So is that required as part of NFPA 80 to test an automated a fire door that has an automatic operator to see if that fire alarm portion will release drop the power on the operator, and then furthermore, if it has electrified panic hardware or fire exit hardware that's retracted, that it'll project upon the fire alarm?
Okay. I'll answer that question first.
Okay.
The short answer is yes, and I'll come back to that, because the other question that you asked me earlier was about my thought about the virtual inspections.
Yes.
And just very quickly, I think it's a very bad idea. I mean,
Okay.
I suppose it's possible for somebody to walk up and hold a camera and kind of scan an opening, but some of the detail that we need to see is very small and minute.
Right.
And it's already difficult enough to see it. One of the best tools you have in your toolkit is a very bright flashlight that you can go in all the dark corners, and the cameras just can't get there. But the other problem is you've got to touch it, you've got to feel it, you've got to watch it work. And sometimes part of the inspection process is when that door is actually swinging open and closed, you got to watch the frame on the wall to see if it's moving.
Right.
And you're not going to capture that. That's very difficult to capture it. And then you've also got to witness the doors closing and latching. One of the subtleties of these inspections, which gets back to this virtual inspection process, is that we have self-closing doors. A self-closing door is required to close and latch every time it's opened, regardless of how far it's opened. So the inspection points say we test the closing device from the full open position. That's not the only position that we test them from. The reason it says from the full open position is, how many times have you seen when you open the door all the way, it hangs up on the floor,
Right.
or it binds on something else, or if the door closer isn't properly installed, the closer arm itself might bind when it's stretched to the full open position, and the door just won't close. So it's also making sure that the closer has enough energy to bring it all the way closed properly from the full open position. When we move through doors individually, we very rarely open them to 90 degrees. We might get them to 65, 70 degrees. We open them far enough for us to step through. If we're walking through with other people, we might hold the door at 90 degrees. But let's say we have a door that can go 140. We very rarely are going to take it to 140 degrees. Right. So there are all these little wrinkles in it that I don't think the virtual inspection can capture. And it just makes me cringe when people are trying to simplify something that really isn't complicated, but is vitally important, because these fire doors are specially engineered systems. Their one and only job is to contain fire. They have other things to do, but their most important job, I should say, is to contain fire. So that's my thoughts on virtual inspections. Now, where that might help, where that might come in handy though, let's say you have a client,
right?
One of your client facilities, and they have their maintenance team out performing work. Now then that technology, hey Ruben, what do you think of this? And they can take a close-up of it. You can, from a distance, give them some feedback on that item.
Right.
And save making a trip out to the facility. So the technology has use, just not for full-scale inspections.
Makes sense.
Delamination of wood doors or even metal doors is serious consideration that you have to look at, and it's not so much the amount. when you think about the construction of a wood door, the face, those faces, they're like sheets of plywood. But when they are attached to the door and glued to the door, they provide a lot of rigidity, a lot of structural holding power for that door. So as the layers begin to separate, you start to lose that structural integrity. I can't tell you at what point it's too much. I would say it this way. If you can see the core, if you can see the core material, it's probably game over.
Right.
If it's just the top layer, let's say you have a red oak veneer door, plain slash red oak veneer door, and it's just the top layer of veneer, but not the cross banding or the back veneer. It's more cosmetic than anything else.
And in healthcare, I would say it's twofold. It may be interpreted as a deficiency within NFPA 80. It falls under no open holes or breaks. Maybe it's not a hole, but a break on the door. But it's twofold because of the infection control you alluded to earlier. It becomes a non-cleanable surface, but that's separate from NFPA 80. But I just wanted to touch on delamination or defaced laminate. In my interpretation, I thought that was a deficiency within NFPA 80, but you're saying it depends on how much is the face and if the core is exposed.
It really does. And what I would recommend is you take a close-up picture of it, get some details of it, go back to the door manufacturer and ask, is this significant? What are we, because cosmetic damage is not pretty, but as long as the door is functional and it's going to perform its ultimate task, we should be good to go. So you kind of have to balance it that way. Now, the other thing about open holes, especially when we're dealing with metal doors, I've seen some inspectors get very picky about, do you know what a weep hole is in a door? In the bottom channels and in the top channels, there are holes during the manufacturing process. So if water were to get in the top channel, it will drain through the door. The holes are there by design to let the moisture out. They're not a deficiency, but some will be extremely literal, and they'll look at the no open holes,
right,
except for those that are allowed to be there. Is really what it should say.
Right.
But
door silencers is another one that comes to.
Silencers can be an issue. It's less of an issue if the frame's grouted in masonry. But it could be an issue in a stud wall partition because you've got those voids inside the wall. But the thinking about those drywall frames, especially the slip over frames where we have compression anchors, you have a hole through the soffit of the frame to reach the adjustment screws. Those holes are allowed to be there, but I've seen those cited as deficiencies, and they're not. They're just not. I saw one inspection report. Well, I get forwarded a lot of different emails and things. So some of the stuff I don't know how real it is, but I get, hey, what do you think about this? And look at this. And some strike plates have a hole for a deadbolt and a latch bolt. But if you only have a latch bolt on the lock, is the hole for the deadbolt on a strike plate a deficiency? And I would say no, because
what about when they modify or file down a strike to allow it to latch? You consider that a modification to the strike in the context of NFPA 80?
I'm going to say it really depends, because there are so many variables when that frame and door are installed. If they're slightly out of alignment, a little bit of filing is perfectly fine. In fact, that's part of, in some of the installation instructions, that's part of the techniques, the troubleshooting techniques. Where it becomes a problem is when somebody really grossly oversizes the holes, and now you got a door that's gonna rattle in the strike, or when we have board locks and they have that little auxiliary dead latch pin that rides on the back of the latch bolt. If that pin drops into the strike hole, now the door might bind. You lose security, but you also might cause that door to bind. Okay. So there's a lot of conditions that it all depends on.
Gotcha. And then the final one was the integrated testing with the fire alarm, as far as some of these electrified exit hardware. Because we've done simulated testing where we'll, and it's kind of going over our inspection kind of perform, or what we're supposed to do in an inspection. We'll take the end caps off, take the power source out from the panic hardware, in this case, fire exit hardware, the electrified fire exit hardware, just to simulate if it would latch upon a power loss of the operator as well. But ultimately, you don't know if that's happening unless you do the fire alarm integrated test. Is that something that's required, or is it even worth doing, or not? I wouldn't say worth, but what are your thoughts on that in general?
It's absolutely part of it. NFPA 80 talks about, in Chapter 5, it talks about the doors being tested by all means of activation.
Okay.
So when we have, let's say we have your automated pair of doors, so you've got an operator on it, you've got vertical latching fire exit hardware devices on it. So we have to test that door a couple different ways. First and foremost, they have to work as a non-powered self-closing door assembly.
Right.
So we test them without energizing the operators. We mechanically open them, watch them close. They have to close and latch properly. Then we can start processing these other tests. We have to test them for power loss. So if some of the operators will have a hold open period, they'll swing open, they'll stay open for 10 seconds and then they close. But if there's an alarm condition, they should come back closed. The power to the operator should drop out in most cases. The doors should become self-closing. If we lose power to the operator, or in this case, even if we have electric latch retraction fire exit hardware devices, if we lose power to the electric latch retraction, those latches have to engage. So right. you've got to test for power loss at the fire exit hardware device and at the door operator. The whole opening has to be confirmed how it works. And when we talk about doing it, coordinating these testing, some of these testing cycles have to be coordinated with other systems like the fire alarm or smoke alarm or smoke detector systems, sprinkler systems, and that's something that as a third-party inspector, we can't do. Right. We can only do so much. And then the rest of our report should say, when you conduct these other inspections, make sure somebody verifies and then give them a list of what to verify. A good example of that would be a door that's arranged for automatic closing. There's only so much we can do. We've got to test it as a manually operated self-closing door. Right. We have to pull it they're held open magnetically. We have to pull them off their magnets, let them go, and they should close. We have to simulate power loss to the magnets. And then we have to simulate an alarm condition. And those are things that we can't do. So right. when you get into those other types, now I should say this, there are certain wall magnets out there that have a little red button on the bottom of them that allow you to simulate that power loss. Okay. Not all of them have it. But when it's time to coordinate it with the other systems, the owner, or whoever's conducting other tests, they need to start by zone, all of the automatic closing doors held open, conduct their test. Let's say it's the fire alarm test, and then walk the floor. They don't have to stand there and watch each door close individually. Right. If they start with 12 doors open, after they conduct the test, 12 doors should be closed and latched, and just verify that is continuing to be done. So that there's a limitation for us as third-party inspectors. And that just reminded me of another point. The difference between a third-party inspector and somebody who's doing the inspections in-house is that they can divide the work up. NFPA 80 says that fire doors shall be inspected. Every fire door shall be inspected not less than annually. That's the verbiage that it uses, not less than annually. It does not say that all doors in a building fire doors in a building shall be tested at the same time each year as a group.
Gotcha.
So the owners have the advantage in that they can break the work up. They can do 1/12 of it every month. It's a lot easier to handle. If we're a third-party inspector and we're traveling to a facility, especially if we're going to get on an airplane and go somewhere, we're going to take it all at once, do as much work as we can, and give them this massive report.
Right.
And it's probably better to do it in smaller chunks. But that's another subtlety that people overlook, is that there's no requirement to do them all at once.
Right. You can break it into segments and make it more manageable. That's a good point.
Absolutely.
Definitely. All right. Well, Keith, I think we're out of time here, and I appreciate you coming on board, and I've been looking forward to this podcast. I know we were supposed to, as I said earlier, do an in-person one, but things happen, and here we are adjusting, trying to stay up with the times. Real quick, can you plug your how to get a hold of you, your email, your LinkedIn, your website, and ultimately what services you can offer?
Sure. Thank you. You can follow me on LinkedIn. Just search for my name, Keith Pardoe, on LinkedIn, and you'll find me. You can come to my website, doorsafety.com.
Okay.
And that's a new website that I'm building, and you're going to see some, the good and the bad about the pandemic. It gives me lots of time to write new content and record new videos. So there's a lot of stuff coming to the website, some new courses. I'm building my own door safety inspector certification program.
Oh, nice.
And some other things, a door safety technician, which would be for installers, to teach them how to install fire doors better. I'm in the process of completing the second edition of my handbook, which I mentioned earlier that I've done some training for ASHE's members.
Right.
They published the first edition of my handbook, but the audience is much larger. And what we will be seeing in a not too distant future, I'm sure, we're going to see these inspections moving into school districts and colleges and universities and other types of non-residential buildings. So we're learning a lot by working with the healthcare industry, but sooner or later, it's going to be part of the normal course of business in all types of buildings. So there's a need for this education. There's a lot of good stuff coming. You can reach me simply at kpardoe@doorsafety.com. That's my main website or email address. And I'm here to help. I'm starting to record some more webinars that'll be posted here in the not too distant future.
Okay. So, and those webinars, because I've attended pretty much all the ones you've done that I gathered from LinkedIn. Are those available still and archived into your website?
They are. And in fact, I'm starting to take the ones that I've recorded and make them into like mini lessons.
Nice.
So that you can get a little certificate from them, and you can, a quiz, a 15, 20 question quiz you can take on it, because there's much more to talk about than just, there's been a lot of talk about what to inspect.
Right.
Not so much how to inspect it or when to inspect it, and how to process these doors. So that's the other side of what I'm trying to build, is how do you approach this? How do you do this?
Okay.
Because and then how do you maintain the doors? Because the end users are the people who are there every day, and they need to know how to properly maintain their doors. No,
definitely. All right. Well, again, I want to thank you for your time, and enjoyed our conversation today. We think we covered a lot of good topics, and we'll be keeping in touch, and maybe we could do another one soon on a different topic related to fire doors, smoke doors.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you, Ruben.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Goodbye.
All right. Bye.